When Western intelligence analysts got their first good look at her, they couldn't agree on what they were seeing. She was 273 meters long, displaced 43,000 tons, and belonged to no recognized category of warship. 8 P-500 basalt missile launchers ran the length of her forward deck, yet 12 Yak-38 jump jets were crammed on the back. It barely made sense, and that was the point. The Soviet Navy needed an aircraft carrier. The only way to sneak one out of the Black Sea was to build a carrier that was not one. In October 1962, the world collectively held its breath. Soviet ships, loaded with nuclear missiles, were heading straight for Cuba, just a short 90 miles from the coast of Florida. President John F. Kennedy had to act decisively. He drew a line in the ocean, setting up a naval quarantine across the Atlantic, blocking the path to the island. And enforcing that line was the single most powerful concentration of naval might ever assembled, Task Force 136. At its core sat the aircraft carriers. USS Enterprise, the world's first nuclear-powered carrier, had scrambled from Norfolk with her air wing still loading ordnance. USS Independence steamed up from the Caribbean, with the carriers Essex, Randolph, and a handful of others creating an impenetrable wall of steel across every possible vector. The message was clear. Overhead, F-8 Crusaders and A-4 Skyhawks were on constant patrol, snapping photos of every Soviet ship, practically skimming their bridges, making sure Moscow got the message. America had about 200 carrier planes ready to strike Cuba. The Soviets had none. In Moscow, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov watched the crisis unfold with what must have been excruciating clarity. He'd commanded the Soviet Navy since 1956, 6 long years of building submarines and missile cruisers while insisting, publicly at least, that aircraft carriers were obsolete relics of American imperialism. But now those relics had his country by the throat. Soviet submarines were lurking beneath the quarantine line, yes. 4 of them had nuclear torpedoes and came frighteningly close to using them. But submarines can't enforce a blockade. They can't secure air superiority. They can't plant themselves on the horizon and challenge you to do something about it. The American carriers could do all of that, and Gorshkov had nothing to counter them with. The freighters turned back. Khrushchev blinked. The missiles already in Cuba were withdrawn in exchange for the American promise to remove their nuclear Jupiter missiles from Turkey. It would be remembered as a triumph of diplomacy, of back-channel diplomacy, of rational heads prevailing. But in the Soviet Navy, it was a hard lesson learned. American carriers had called the shots, and the Soviet Navy had been forced to watch from the sidelines in their own confrontation. The military problem was obvious enough. The ideological trap made it impossible to solve. Since the Khrushchev era, Soviet doctrine had explicitly rejected aircraft carriers as tools of capitalist aggression. The party had pushed its propaganda point for years. Carriers existed to project power onto foreign shores, to bully smaller nations, to enforce imperial will. Socialist defense needed no such weapons. The USSR would rely on submarines to threaten enemy fleets and land-based bombers to strike from the motherland itself. Carriers were expensive, vulnerable, and morally suspect, floating symbols of everything wrong with Western militarism. Gorshkov knew this was nonsense. Or rather, he knew it was nonsense that he couldn't openly call nonsense. The man had spent his career navigating Soviet bureaucracy, and he understood that ideological arguments often trumped strategic ones or Kremlin meetings. You didn't walk into the Politburo and announce that Comrade Khrushchev's naval doctrine was flawed. Not if you wanted to keep your job or your life. But the fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. The need for a carrier was suddenly undeniable, even if nobody could quite say it out loud. American carriers were essentially sovereign territory on the move, floating airfields that could show up anywhere in the world without asking permission. They turned the entire ocean into an extension of US power. The Soviets had nothing that came close. Their submarines could sink ships, sure, but they couldn't actually control the critical shipping lanes. Their long-range bombers could hit the Atlantic, but they couldn't stick around, couldn't react quickly, couldn't just own a section of the ocean for weeks on end. Admiral Gorshkov knew it. The Navy knew it. Strategically, the Soviet Union absolutely needed a carrier, but asking for one, that was like a priest requesting funds to build a casino. The very thing they needed was the one thing they were forbidden to want. And until someone figured out how to square that circle, the Soviet Navy would remain all talk when it came to naval warfare. Something had to give. Gorshkov's boiled down to 6 words. Tyazholy aviansystrai kreyser. Heavy aircraft carrying cruiser. It was not a carrier. It was a heavy cruiser, missiles and all, that just happened to have some planes on board. The difference is ridiculous, a bit of semantic wrangling, nothing more. But Gorshkov knew a thing or two about the Soviet system. The Kremlin didn't have to be sold on the idea that carriers were a good thing. Half the admirals in the building already knew that. What they needed was a way to sign off on the project without admitting they'd been wrong for 15 years. They needed a face-saving fiction, a name that would allow them to pretend the party line was still in effect without going about the business of abandoning it. A heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser provided them with just that. The new vessel would be a missile cruiser, first and foremost, and an aviation platform second. The aircraft were defensive armament, no different from the helicopters already operating from Soviet destroyers. The Politburo could approve funding without Khrushchev's ghost rising from the grave to accuse them of ideological treason. The Navy could finally get its floating airfield. Everyone wins, everyone saves face, and nobody has to admit that American carriers had been right all along. That was problem one. Problem two was geography. The Chernomorski shipyard in Nikolaev, Ukraine, was the only facility in the entire Soviet Union capable of building a ship this large. It sat on the northern coast of the Black Sea, roughly 300 kilometers from the open water of that inland sea, and the Black Sea itself was a trap. One way in, one way out. The Turkish Straits, that narrow passage connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Turkey, a NATO member since 1952, controlled those crucial straits. Passage through those waters was strictly regulated, not simply a matter of asking nicely. Since 1936, the Montreux Convention, an international agreement, had governed exactly which warships could transit and under what conditions. The treaty imposes limits on tonnage, requires advance notification, and restricts how long foreign warships can remain in the Black Sea. For aircraft carriers, the restriction was simpler. They couldn't pass through at all, at least not in the direction Gorshkov was interested. So Gorshkov faced a brutal geographic equation. He could build his carrier in the only shipyard capable of constructing it, but that carrier would be trapped in the Black Sea forever, unable to reach the Atlantic or Pacific where it was actually needed. The Soviet Navy would have a brand new flat top with nowhere to go. Unless, of course, it wasn't technically a carrier. The Montreux Convention's ship categories were far from perfect. What precisely made an aircraft carrier different from a cruiser that just happened to carry a few planes? The treaty simply wasn't specific enough, and Gorshkov's clever hybrid design took full advantage of that ambiguity. For instance, all you had to do was look at the bow of a Kiev-class ship, P-500 basalt anti-ship missiles, SAN-3 surface-to-air missiles, anti-submarine rockets, torpedo tubes, 76mm guns. This thing bristled with weapons that had nothing to do with aviation. The flight deck occupied maybe a third of the ship's length, crammed into the stern, almost as an afterthought. Gorshkov's argument to Turkey was implicit but unmistakable. Those missiles made it a cruiser, and the planes were an auxiliary defensive armament. Therefore, nothing in Montreux prohibited a cruiser from transiting the Straits. Turkey could have challenged the classification. NATO lawyers certainly raised the issue, but that would mean a standoff at the Bosphorus, a Soviet warship waiting at the entrance, while diplomats argued over dictionary definitions. It meant turning a legal ambiguity into an international incident. Ankara decided it was not worth the risk. Kiev passed through the Turkish Straits in 1976. Minsk followed in 78. Novorossiysk in 82. Baku in 87. Every single time, the Soviets filed paperwork classifying the ship as a cruiser, and every single time, Turkey let it slide. 6 words had done the impossible. Heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser deceived 2 audiences simultaneously. Moscow got the ideological cover to approve a carrier without calling it one. Ankara got just enough ambiguity to avoid a confrontation nobody wanted. 1 phrase, 2 lies, and suddenly the Soviet Navy had a path to blue water. The only question left was whether the ship itself would actually work. The first Kiev slid down the slipway at Nikolaev in December 1972. When Western intelligence analysts finally got a good look at her, they weren't quite sure what they were seeing. The ship looked like someone had taken a missile cruiser, sliced off the back third, and welded on half an aircraft carrier, because that's essentially what the Soviets had done. From the bow to roughly amidships, Kiev looked every bit the guided missile cruiser. Her forward deck bristled with weaponry that would make any surface combatant jealous. 8 massive P-500 basalt launchers housed missiles capable of reaching targets over 500 kilometers away. Each one carried either a 1,000-kilogram high-explosive warhead, or, for when things went truly apocalyptic, the 350-kiloton nuclear warhead. A pair of twin SAN-3 launchers provided long-range air defense, backed by 72 missiles in the magazines below. Shorter-range SAN-4 systems added another layer of protection. Twin 76mm guns, anti-submarine rocket launchers, torpedo tubes. The whole shebang was there. And then you moved on to the rear of the ship, and suddenly you found yourself on a 4.5-degree angled flight deck with a horizontal stack island to starboard. On this deck would be a dozen or so Yak-38 jump jets and another dozen Kamov helicopters. 2 warfare missions, 1 hull, a Frankenstein's warship. On paper, the plan was brilliant. At full load, Kiev was a monster, displacing 43,000 tons of water and measuring 273 meters long. She had a crew of 1,600. In theory, this one ship was a triple threat. Her helicopters attacked submarines. Her vertical takeoff fighters and SAMs protected the fleet against air attack, and her cruise missiles struck enemy surface ships. That's Soviet efficiency for you. 3 big missions, 1 big ship. The truth was uglier. Every weapon system on that ship represented a compromise, a trade-off against something else. There was massive P-500 launchers ate up prime real estate on the forward deck, space that a conventional carrier would have used for aircraft. The missile magazines occupied volume below decks that could have stored aviation fuel or additional aircraft. Kiev carried roughly 12 to 15 Yak-38s, depending on the mission. A contemporary American carrier like the Nimitz embarked close to 90 aircraft. The Soviets had built a ship that could do 3 jobs, but each one at maybe a third the capacity of a dedicated platform. The command problem was even worse. In a U.S. Navy carrier battle group, different ships handled different missions. Frigates and destroyers focused on hunting submarines, their sonar teams working that problem full-time. Aegis cruisers managed the air defense picture, tracking dozens of contacts simultaneously. The carrier itself concentrated on aviation operations. Each ship had one primary job, one captain, one combat information center tuned to one specific kind of warfare. On Kiev, a single captain and his combat team had to juggle all 3 simultaneously. Helicopters 10 miles to the east, dipping sonar and tracking a possible submarine contact. A pair of Yak-38s scrambling off the deck to intercept an incoming maritime patrol aircraft from the north. Missile crews spinning up the P-500s for a coordinated strike against a surface group somewhere over the western horizon. 3 tactical pictures, 3 threat axes, 3 different weapon systems with different engagement timelines, all feeding into one overtaxed command center. Western analysts were very critical of the arrangement. The Soviet system forced one crew to juggle the jobs normally handled by 3 specialized teams. While this might be okay for peacetime drills with scenarios they already knew, the pressure on the command team would be too much during a real fight, especially when an enemy is involved, and things rarely go according to plan. Decisions that needed to happen in seconds would get bottlenecked. Priorities would conflict. Something would slip through the cracks. The Soviet Navy wasn't blind to these problems. They trained hard, developed procedures, and tried to make the concept work through sheer discipline and professionalism. But you can't train your way out of a fundamental design limitation. Kiev was a ship designed by committee, built by compromise, and cursed to do 3 jobs at half strength. And the problems didn't stop with the hull. The aircraft that gave Kiev a reason for existing had issues of their own. If Kiev's divided hull was a strategic compromise, her air wing was a tactical catastrophe. To make the heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser concept work, the Soviets didn't just need a unique ship, they needed a miracle plane. Since Kiev lacked the catapults and long runways of American carriers, her ability to project power rested entirely on the Yakovlev Yak-38. It was supposed to be the Soviet answer to the British Harrier. In reality, it was the anchor that dragged the entire Kiev-class down. The fatal flaw was in the propulsion system. Unlike the Harrier, which used a single engine to vector thrust, the Yak-38 lugged around 3 engines, one for forward flight and 2 dedicated lift jets behind the cockpit, used only for takeoff and landing. An ungainly compromise that sought to get the same results as Western technology without the years of research and development. This design turned the aircraft into a logistical nightmare for Kiev. The lift jets were dead weight during normal flight, eroding the plane's range. Worse, they had a service life of roughly 22 hours. Every time a pilot hovered off the deck, the clock ticked down on an engine replacement. The ship's mechanics spent nearly as much time swapping engines as the pilots spent flying them. Soviet aviators quickly realized that pure vertical takeoffs, the very thing the ship was designed for, were combat ineffective. A vertical launch consumed so much fuel and thrust that the aircraft couldn't carry a meaningful weapon load. To fix this, they developed a dangerous workaround: the rolling short takeoff. Instead of lifting straight up, pilots would start their engines and roll forward along Kiev's short flight deck, using forward momentum to generate wing lift before rotating the nozzles. It was a harrowing maneuver on a deck cluttered with weapons and lacking a ski jump ramp, but it allowed them to squeeze a little more weight off the deck. But even this innovation couldn't defeat physics. Kiev and her sisters were often deployed to the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean to counter American influence. But in those tropical environments, the hybrid carrier concept fell apart. Hot air is less dense than cold air, which starved the Yk-38's lift engines of thrust. During Minsk's deployment to the Indian Ocean, the heat wave was so severe that even with the rolling takeoff technique, the aircraft could barely get airborne. Pilots faced an absurd choice: take off with fuel or take off with weapons. They couldn't do both. The carrier half of Kiev was effectively neutralized by a hot afternoon. The ship would be sailing in a combat zone, ostensibly providing air cover, while her fighters were physically unable to lift the missiles needed to defend her. The aircraft wasn't just useless, it was actively fighting its pilots. The complex three-engine system was so prone to failure during hover that engineers installed an automatic ejection system. If the computer detected the plane pitching or rolling too sharply during the vertical phase, which was a sign of lift jet failure, it fired the pilot out of the cockpit automatically. This led to harrowing incidents where crews watched a salvageable aircraft suddenly shoot its pilot into the air because a sensor misfired. Nobody in Moscow ever stood up and acknowledged the Kiev-class had been a mistake. That's not how the Soviet system worked. Programs didn't fail. They were superseded or evolved or quietly buried under new initiatives with different names. But by the mid-1980s, everyone paying attention could read the writing on the wall. The first sign was Kuznetsov. In 1983, the Soviets laid down a new carrier at the same Nikolaev shipyard that had birthed Kiev's. Originally named Riga, then Leonid Brezhnev, then Tbilisi. She would eventually enter service as Admiral Kuznetsov, and she looked nothing like her predecessors. Gone was the missile cruiser bow, previously stuffed with P-500 launchers. In its place, a full-length flight deck stretched from stem to stern, complete with a distinctive ski jump ramp at the bow. Kuznetsov displaced over 60,000 tons, a staggering 50% more than the older Kiev's. More critically, she was designed from the keel up to handle conventional high-performance aircraft. No longer just hobbled jump jets with 22-hour engine lives. These were real fighters. She carried Sukhoi Su-27Ks, the naval variant of the Soviet Union's premier air superiority fighter. They were aircraft capable of going toe-to-toe with American F-14 Tomcats. The Soviets were constructing a real carrier. They were still referring to it as an aircraft-carrying cruiser for Montreux Treaty reasons, and Kuznetsov did retain some missile weaponry, because old dogs can't learn new tricks. But make no mistake, priorities had changed. Aviation was now the primary concern. The compromised design was being phased out, even if no one would admit it. The first indicator was the Yk-141. The Yakovlev Design Bureau knew the Yk-38 was a mess. They'd known this for years. So they set about designing a successor, a supersonic VTOL fighter that could finally hold its own against Western planes. The Yk-141 Freestyle was the exact opposite of the Forger. It could exceed Mach 1.7. It had a proper radar system. It could carry a decent payload. Test pilots who flew the prototypes reportedly loved it, which was a far cry from the terror the Yk-38 inspired. In 1991, a Yk-141 prototype conducted flight trials from the deck of Admiral Gorshkov, the fourth and final Kiev-class ship. For a brief moment, it looked like the hybrid carriers might get a second lease on life. With a capable aircraft, maybe the concept could finally work as intended. Then one of the prototypes crashed on Gorshkov's deck. The pilot safely ejected, but the aircraft was lost. A short time later, the Soviet Union itself fell apart. The Yk-141 project was scrapped, its budget drying up, along with the nation that had funded it. The aircraft that might have saved the Kiev-class went down with the empire that built it. The original Kievs were already being cannibalized for parts by then. The Soviet Navy, reeling from a failing economy and shrinking budgets, couldn't afford to keep 4 carrier cruisers in commission. Something had to give, and it was the original Kievs. Kiev herself, the first of the class, was retired from frontline service in the late 1980s. The final years of her Soviet service were spent moored at a dock, officially used as a training ship and floating barracks. Unofficially, she was a parts car. When Admiral Gorshkov needed a replacement part, the ship's maintenance personnel walked over to Kiev and harvested it. Engines, electronics, hydraulics, whatever kept the younger sister running, came from the remains of the oldest. The firstborn sacrificed to keep the last. Minsk and Novorossiysk fared little better. Both were effectively sidelined, maintained at minimal readiness, consuming resources the Navy could barely spare. The writing was clear to anyone willing to read it. The Kiev-class had been a 15-year experiment, and the experiment was over. The Soviets never held a press conference to admit the compromise had failed. They never published an official assessment concluding that hybrid carrier cruisers were a dead end. They just stopped building them. They started building something else, and they let the ships they had slowly rot from the inside out. The silence said more than any announcement ever could. The Soviet Union died on December 26, 1991, and the Kiev-class carriers followed slowly, strangely. Russia was left with 4 old hybrid white elephants that it couldn't afford to keep. With their birthplace, the Chernomorsk shipyard, now part of independent Ukraine, and the Russian economy in a free fall, keeping one carrier afloat was a long shot. 4 was a pipe dream. Novorossiysk led the way. She was retired in 1993 and towed to South Korea, where she was scrapped. A warship that once carried nuclear-tipped missiles with the potential to annihilate an American battle group was reduced to razor blades, car parts, and kitchenware. Kiev and Minsk fared no better. Their fate would have horrified their Soviet designers. The billion-ruble behemoths, designed to rival American naval power, were sold to Chinese developers in the mid-1990s. It wasn't American torpedoes that sank the Cold War's most audacious naval compromise, but pure capitalism. Admiral Gorshkov, the final and most modern of the Kiev-class, lingered on into the 1990s, mostly tied to the dock and rusting away. Her training exercises shortened every year. By 1999, with her aircraft gone and her systems badly degraded, she was little more than a shipwreck, her days numbered in months rather than years. Then India came calling. The Indians had been shopping for a carrier. Their aging INS Virat, a former British light carrier, was approaching the end of her service life, and New Delhi wanted a replacement. Russia offered Admiral Gorshkov at a bargain price, practically giving the ship away in exchange for a lucrative refit contract. India said yes. What happened next proved what critics had suspected all along. The Indians didn't want a hybrid carrier cruiser. They wanted a carrier. So they tore Gorshkov apart and rebuilt her from the hangar deck up. The P-500 missile launchers came out. The SAN-3 systems came out. All the cruiser armament that had defined the Kiev-class. All the weaponry that had justified calling these ships something other than carriers. All of it was stripped away and thrown in the scrap heap. In its place went a full-length flight deck with a ski jump bow. New aircraft elevators, modern electronics, facilities for operating MiG-29K fighters, real carrier aircraft with real capabilities. When the ship finally emerged from the Severodvinsk shipyard in 2013, rechristened INS Vikramaditya, she was unrecognizable. The hybrid was gone. Only the carrier remained. The Indians had paid billions to prove what the Soviets had spent 2 decades trying to deny. The compromise didn't work. The only way to make these ships useful was to remove the very thing that had defined them. Strip away the lie, and you were left with what Gorshkov had actually needed back in 1962. A proper aircraft carrier. No apologies, no semantic games, no bureaucratic fig leaves.